We are incredibly excited to have you here yet again, and just really glad that you're taking your time to spend your lunch break with us. So I do want to kick off programming right away. Like I said, it is a full program. Just a few reminders: keep yourself on mute if you're not speaking. That way, there's no background noise. And if you have questions, please pop them into the chat bot, or you can use the raise your hand option and ask the questions yourself to the speakers. But we do absolutely welcome that and encourage any interaction. So I think I'll start by turning it over to Brian Johnson. Brian, I know you wanted to give an update on where we stand internally and as a state. So you can go ahead and get started.
Oh, thank you, Rachel, and welcome everybody again. Great to see the crew. Great to see Ginger and Dave, our friends from Greenberg Trard here. Ginger, thanks for joining us from out in the West Coast. So just a couple quick updates I wanted to talk to you about is the SBA this week released forgiveness documents, a forgiveness application for the PPP loan. We sent that out this morning, and we have it on our COVID-19 resources page at massmedic.com. Make sure to review that. Make sure to take really good notes about why you chose to take the loan, document as much as possible the economic necessity, consider into all that not only sort of billings but collections and things like that. I think it's just really important as the standards keep changing for the loans that you protect yourself, and remember that if there is going to be sort of audits of these loans, it's going to be in a different time period, so it will be sort of done in hindsight. So make sure you just document everything you have and take a look at those. They're on our COVID-19 resources page. And clearly at this point, we're starting to emerge and come back to our places of work slowly but surely. We've been engaging in a lot of conversations about this, about what return to work looks like. There's really no return to normal for the time being. But I just wanted to stress a couple things. We had a call yesterday with our corporate social responsibility working group. And, it's amazing to me just some of the ways in which business leaders are talking about their employees and talking about how their employees are going to perceive them in the future. And, I was really struck by one company's CEO who said, we need to think about how our workers are going to look at us post this and how we acted and behaved during this time. Do we want to be the company that, pushed them to go to work when we didn't know it was safe? Or do we want to be the company that told them to stay home and protect your families and be with your families, and your jobs are going to be here and we're going to make it work for you? And, I was just very sort of touched by that. And I think it's really important too, that if these conversations are happening at the biggest companies, that our mid-size and small companies should make sure that they're having these conversations as well. And they should also take into account, there are going to be factors beyond whether or not it is safe to return to work or not. And I think primarily we should really be conscious of the fact that we still don't have school. We still don't have any clarity on summer camps, and we still don't really have any idea as to when there'll be widespread daycares and things like that opening up in Massachusetts. Even though we have I think a pretty reasonably thought out phased plan, everything is going to depend on the numbers. And, I think as business leaders, we need to really think about how we message the return to work dialogue and make sure that as we're doing it, we don't unnecessarily put our workers who may or may not be primary caregivers of their children or parents, make them feel that they're either being forced back to work or put in a position that they're uncomfortable. So, we will likely dedicate much more time to this subject in the weeks ahead, and we're going to be bringing on experts and things like that to make sure that everybody understands all that they need to know. The CDC has released guidance. We have some guidance on our COVID-19 resources page. We've been updating that. I think you should all go and take a look. It's updated very frequently. Anytime there's new information, we have it. We have quick links. We have best practices and things like that. So we'll be releasing that. We'll be diving way more into this subject as we move forward. I know from our perspective, MassMedic, we're going to continue to work remotely for the foreseeable future. But, as you can see, and I just wanted to give a shout out to Rachel for all of her hard work. We just completed an incredible fundraiser uh, for the Women in MedTech um, virtual forum, and we raised almost $3,500 for survivors of domestic assault and sexual abuse. And we produced 4 incredible programs in 4 weeks. We had inspiring speakers. We talked about mental health. We talked about really about how you can thrive, not only survive, but thrive in this period. And I'm so proud of that work. And it's all on our playlist on YouTube. I really encourage you guys to take a listen to it. There's a lot of inspiring content on there, and you can still donate to New Hope, the charity who we worked with in the coming weeks. So as we continue to evolve and change, we're going to continue to try and capture all this content we've created. We've created more than 15 hours of original broadcast content in the past 10 weeks. It's a huge effort. It's not easy. So I just want to thank our team at Mass Medic and all of our members who have stepped up and participated. So that's all I got, Rachel. Thank you.
Thanks, Brian. And I echo that to all of our speakers and everyone who's been contributing to all of this content. Thank you so much. We couldn't do it without you. And it wouldn't be, we wouldn't be who we are as an organization without all of your support. So thank you, thank you, thank you. And we'll continue to thank you. So I am going to turn it over to Ginger Piggott at this point from Greenberg Traurig. She is going to share with us, and I'm going to attempt to share my screen to bring up Ginger's slides, and just bear with me one moment. And can everyone see that?
Yes.
All right, I will try to put it in play mode and see if I can advance them that way. But Ginger, I will let you take it away.
Great. And actually, I can't see the slides, but that is okay because I know what's on them. So we'll just, we'll go with that. So I'm Ginger Piggott. I'm from Greenberg Traurig. I'm a litigator. My specialty is working with medical device and some pharma companies, biotech, med device, MedTech. And one of the things that I specialize in is product liability litigation, but also in working with companies about litigation trends, talking about how to reduce and mitigate litigation exposure. And obviously, as we all are focused on COVID-19 and what the world looks like for our industry, for life sciences. And so I've been invited to talk briefly about a little bit of an overview if you want to go to the outline page. And as I said, I can't see what you're sharing, so maybe I will try and see if that's possible. But we'll just go ahead and if you can try and I'll go move through them quickly, but I'm going to cover briefly a little bit of an overview about what we're seeing in terms of litigation trends. I'm only going to spend a minute on that. I'm going to spend a couple of minutes on what are the immunity protections that we're seeing from federal government legislation and how do we think that might apply going forward, and then other things that may impact litigation going forward again. In terms of the COVID-19 and litigation trends, we're obviously seeing a significant impact in workflow with court closures, courts doing virtual hearings. Again, this is a one-slide part of my presentation, but there are a number of class actions. Those of you who follow the news will have seen that that attorneys who are looking to profit are always looking for ways to figure out can they file actions. You've seen some novel class actions, some that are geared towards fraudulent conduct, fake products, and then you have some litigation that's involved in price gouging, companies out there trying to protect their own products. And you're seeing various legal defenses that we'll be looking at in terms of how to defend claims against our clients, and also how to protect our clients who are out there in the market trying to do something good for with respect to COVID. So we are seeing class actions being filed relating to COVID, and it'll be interesting for those of us in the legal field to see what happens with that. the bulk of the time that I have, which is again short, wanted to talk about immunity and liability protections. So if we can move on to those slides. Really the main driver there is something called the Public Readiness and Emergency Preparedness Act, the PrEP Act, which I'm sure you've read about. It was codified in 2005, relating to other pandemic, epidemic issues that were going on at the time. And it empowers the Department of Health and Human Services to grant immunity, to issue a declaration, which they have done, to grant immunity against all claims caused by, arising out of, relating to, resulting from, lots of legal words. And this is related to the manufacture, testing, development, distribution, administration, and use of covered countermeasures. So of course, as lawyers, we always like defined terms. What is a covered countermeasure? These are really important questions, similar to what Brian was saying about looking at PPP loans and documenting what you're doing. If you're in an industry or you're in a business that is actually helping with the COVID effort, or have products in the market, or have converted to try and assist with COVID efforts, then it's important to understand whether you are in fact involved as a covered person and involved with a covered countermeasure. I've included a definition in this first slide. Covered countermeasures are any qualified pandemic or epidemic products, and those include a long list that I've included in the slides, which I'm happy to have Rachel share. I won't read from the slides to you, but generally the products must be approved or licensed or authorized by the FDA. There are a couple of ways to do that, and there are specific products, including respiratory protective devices, that are called out in the Coronavirus Aid, Relief, and Economic Securities Act, the CARES Act. So all of these pieces of legislation work together to protect companies from liability. It is intended to motivate companies to jump in and get involved. But as we all know, similar to all of this, is that that doesn't mean that companies won't get sued. So when we look at what does it mean, we're looking at basically covered persons who are suppliers and licensors of those products. And immunity is extended to any device used in a covered countermeasure. So if you're a component part manufacturer, or you have a constituent material that's used in a covered countermeasure. So obviously a lot of questions have come up. And so for that reason, on April 14th, so last month, the Health and Human Services General Counsel, who is one of our former partners actually, issued an advisory opinion, which I recommend either you read or you talk to one of us type lawyers who can explain to you a little bit more about what it means. It's an advisory opinion only. It's not binding on the courts, but it does provide a little more information about what it means to have a covered countermeasure. It does not confer immunity from enforcement actions by the FDA or other federal agency actions. But as you'll see, as I've highlighted later on, a lot of the governmental agencies are backing off of various enforcement in order to allow companies to simply get on with it. But the same as we are seeing with return to the office or return to somewhere outside of our homes, that things are going to get a little murky, and then you're going to start having things being looked at. So it's very important to, again, document how you're responding if you're involved in work that you believe would qualify for immunity. The opinion also highlights a number of what might, products that might be considered covered countermeasures. It provides a list of certain products that are already subject to what's called an emergency use authorization. And Rachel, I don't know where you are, but if you want to keep up with me, we're good. All right. And that basically, if companies want to be proactive, they can apply for these emergency use authorizations, and that actually carries with it its own protection from legal liability. And the other thing the opinion does is that it says that if a company is mistaken but it reasonably believed that it was involved, then it should not lose its immunity, which is a pretty strong statement, and we'll have to see how that plays out with the courts. But the exception, and the big exception, which is no surprise, is willful misconduct. And obviously, the opinion encourages covered persons to, quote, take reasonable precautions to ensure safe use of products. What that means is anyone's guess, but obviously there are a lot of concerns. There are a lot of companies out there that are sharing intellectual property. I think one of the ones that's most well-known is Medtronic, putting out an unrestricted license for its ventilators, basically putting all the specifications out there and saying, you know, go forth and make ventilators. And whether or not liability will be attached to either those who have gone and used that, or whether even Medtronic might be looking at its own liability is interesting. They should be protected under the Act, and we'll have to wait and see. Going on to the emergency use authorization, which I mentioned earlier, those allow the Secretary of Health and Human Services to authorize the introduction of a device that's related to an actual or potential emergency. And so in March 24th, the EUA authorized the emergency use of medical devices such as ventilators, ventilator-related equipment. And so again, that process brings with it a preemption effect. And so for those of you who are unfamiliar with preemption, it basically means that in general, and again, it depends on the preemption, the way that the preemption clause is worded, but in general, it protects companies from state law tort claims, common law claims, and in some cases, contract claims as well, which is what PrEP Act immunity covers. And you know, it does go to negligence and strict liability claims. So if there are personal injuries that are arising out of use of a covered countermeasure, there is some avenue of relief for injured persons, and that has been provided for in the statute as well. And so the idea is that it's intended to make sure that there is some coverage for people, but it's intended to protect companies in a time of crisis. The EUA also waives certain FDA requirements, and this is a bit trickier because the timing makes a difference. The PrEP Act immunity is basically, you know, from basically backdated itself from February, you know, through, I think it's as late as October 1, 2024. So, you know, again, as time goes on, there'll be some more clarity, but you'll want to make sure, again, that if you're involved in that you're getting good advice. And then now I can see the slides again. Fantastic. If we can go on to the next one, great. So preemption, there are a number of places where we have preemption under the PrEP Act, preemption applied to the EUA, and preemption under the traditional, the medical device amendments of the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, which basically typically applies to pre-market approved devices, but there is a growing body of law that has this applying to 510K cleared devices that are subject to device-specific requirements, special controls, and so on. And we're having some success in limiting the types of causes of action or claims that can be brought. So those are traditional legal defenses that apply whether we're talking about COVID-19 countermeasures or not. So that's important for those of you out there who are in this business and not producing products that are being used as part of a covered countermeasure. But the reason I included it here with regard to COVID is that the EUA requirements can also be a trigger for this type of preemption. And we've seen in other epidemic, pandemic settings that preemption has been applied to limit liability. So if we go to the next slide. So and then the one after this. We're talking about other actions that may impact our world, basically. And as I think I previewed before, there are, potentially modified regulatory obligations right now. There's a lot of focus on COVID-19, and now that we're in some ways, and I knock on wood and hope that it's true, that we're beyond the sort of the part of the pandemic where there's a lot of confusion, although I believe there's still a lot of confusion. But as people are getting their arms around at least the therapies to try and treat the people who are most sick, then we'll start to see FDA, EPA, and others looking again more closely at what their enforcement obligations are. As I've already talked about, the PrEP Act is affording broad tort immunity, and it applies to all kinds of failure to warn, design, and manufacturing claims, contract claims, although there's some confusion over what it means that you are protected from both the tort claim and the contract claim regarding damage to property, business interruption, and other things. I know I'm jamming a lot of information into a very short period of time, but I did want to give you some idea of the types of things that are applying in our industry. And if we can go to the next slide, there are obviously unintended consequences to everything we're doing. What we're seeing is a lot of companies who have little to no experience in life sciences jumping in to make sanitizer, to make masks, to make other kinds of PPE, to make and look at different types of drugs, or drugs being used in an off-label fashion in huge proportions. Obviously, again, early focus on shortage needs, and companies having to then figure out what the demand is and how do they get their supply chain working. There's increased oversight and activity among state and local governments and federal government about pricing, price gouging. There's then going to be pressure for some of these local governments to try and recover the costs. And so, again, even the controversy over ethylene oxide, I include this because that had been a big focus, trying to move away from and a lot of focus on the ethylene oxide. And now it's, we need ethylene oxide, and people are using that more than ever for sterilization purposes. And so obviously these things are going to affect how we're perceived and how litigation will proceed. And we'll go to the last slide. And that is that a lot of companies and the industry as a whole is getting a shot in the arm in terms of how people are perceiving companies in the life sciences space as innovative, as being part of in this together. And that's been really wonderful. I've spent the last 28 years representing medical device, life sciences companies, and part of that reason is because it's personal to me. I'm proud to be part of that industry, and the people that I work with are proud to be there. But at times, the reputation takes a hit depending on what's going on and what we're seeing out in the media. And at the moment, we're seeing positive feelings about the industry who've mobilized. And then there's the confusion and fear about whether or not the government is working correctly. And on every side, we're either being over-regulated or under-regulated. And potentially this renewed appreciation for sterilization and for the work that companies do in this space. The plaintiffs tend to try and include that the companies were rushing to market, that there was profits over patient safety, and I think we'll have a lot of good stories to tell there. Again, we don't know for sure all of the various impacts, but I can tell you that we were starting trial when the sort of stay-at-home orders started coming down, and when we were picking the jury, one of the things that was coming out was that there was very low familiarity with one of the issues in our cases that happened to be a drug that could potentially cause lung QT and lead to a significant cardiac event. Well, now there's a lot of discussion of cardiac impacts, as we're talking about whether or not we should be taking, malaria treatment for COVID-19 and what the risks are. And so we think that when we go back, this jury was excused and pick a new jury, we're going to see a different level of comprehension there. And we think that could be favorable for us, depending again on how this all plays out. So I think I've actually done this in the amount of time I was given. It's a lot of information, but I really did want to just introduce you to some ideas and be available for questions if there are any. So thank you very much for the opportunity.
So Ginger, I'd like to
Brian.
jump in with a couple questions just to start off. The environment for which prosecution lawsuits will happen is likely going to be long after the crisis has concluded. So I'm curious, what are the technologies that you think are the most vulnerable? I mean, I look at primarily EUAs are for personal protective equipment testing and then treatment. But I wonder if there's going to be technologies that are more susceptible to product liability, and if there will be factors included such as high rates of false negatives, or we had a sterilization device that we thought could do 20 masks but could only do 10 in sort of post-market studies. Or how do companies protect themselves if their heart's in the right place, they're doing what they can? The early data indicates that they're going to be able to meet these standards, but when it's all comes out in the end, 1 year, 2 years from now, and the data does not back these claims, how do they protect themselves?
I think that it's a kind of what you said earlier, which is you need to document those best efforts. And the immunity and the statutory language is pretty strong. So operating within the guidelines that exist at the time you're operating within them and documenting that you have done that is important. And just like in any situation where even though you may not be sued, and so let's say you're building ventilators, or your example where you have sterilization equipment that it turns out can only properly sterilize 10 masks instead of the 20 that you had indicated it could do. And as you're going forward through this period, and again, through this as late as October 2024 period, you're protected, but the story that you have to tell about how soon you recognized the limitation, that it was 10, how soon you took action about that, and documenting those things all make a difference, just like it would if immunity didn't apply. So, companies out there that we work with who don't have necessarily a blanket legal defense, but do have, are regulated, the ones that are working intelligently, who are also being careful the way that they're communicating about the potential for problems. We never want to limit companies from identifying issues, but what we see on the litigation side is there are a lot of emails that are later, again in hindsight, that make it look like, hey, we knew about this a lot earlier than we did.
Right.
Look, this PrEP Act protection, and if you have an EUA, it's good. Now, again, no willful misconduct. Could somebody look back and say this was willful? The companies that are out there doing it for the right reasons, they just need to document it. That's going to be the best protection that we're seeing right now, and that we've seen looking back at other companies or healthcare providers who were sued under earlier declarations of immunity that the Health and Human Services issued back in 2005 when the PrEP Act was first enacted.
And I think it's important. I think you said something really important about sort of public perception, because if we think back to last October, and the industry is facing a series of investigative articles which basically accused the 510K system of being a free subway turnstile, a broken broken subway turnstile to market where we were pushing through unsafe devices, and their big data point was that 1% of the 8 million devices incidents that they had studied had caused great harm or death. I mean, we do have to be sort of cognizant that, all these narratives can be used in hindsight. But I just think in terms of, when that was coming out, I had thought maybe preemption could be in trouble. Is your feeling now that perhaps preemption could be expanded from PMA devices and EUAs to 510K?
Interestingly, at the same time as some of this has been coming out, we have been seeing success, as I said, in with 510K cleared products that are subject to special controls, particularly 2 examples in the lens care category, where the FDA is involved in a way that provides these special controls. There's a guidance that we actually call, requirements in court cases, and we've been successful in expanding preemption in a couple of cases to apply. And before Regal, so back in the early days of my practice, we often used preemption for 510K cleared devices. I don't believe we'll ever go back to a day where your straightforward 510K substantial equivalence, submission is subject to preemption, but we will, and we do look hard at whether or not, how involved was the FDA in this 510K process, and whether the FDA actually did weigh in, particularly on failure to warn claims. So if labeling is subject to a monograph, or there are special controls about what you can put, either the design, so what ingredients are you restricted to, ingredients being both, as a device, what components. So like lens care is actually treated as a device. And so again, under the 510K with special controls, we do see preemption, and that's been since these articles have come out. So we're optimistic.
Great. And then there is a question here about what happens to EUA products with emergency use authorization. When will they have to go back to the FDA to get a 510K? Is there a timeline on that, or will they have to do that? I think they will, right?
I think they will, but I will say that I'm not a regulatory lawyer. And so what I would do is go to Mickey Colton in my DC office and ask her, when do they have to do that? Because I do think that that's obviously an emergency use authorization, which means it is intended for the emergency only, and I would not count on that. And I don't remember whether or not it actually, when you receive the EUA, whether it has any instructions specific to your
Yeah, actually, Eric, who asked the question, I do believe, now that we're talking about it, we did cover this in a previous session. I think it's when the emergency use authorization is removed by the feds. So we're in a period now where they declared, FDA's commissioner declared the EUAs back in early February, I think February 2nd.
Yes.
And so it will be until that is now deemed not to be an emergency state of emergency, and then you'll have a certain amount of time. And then I just want to thank you for your time, and I'm really curious, the poster behind you, I love it. Very cool.
It's an Italian film poster. Fortunately on Amazon, which is me. It's supposed to inspire me when I come.
Absolutely. Well, you are a giant in your field, Ginger. Thank you so much for everything, and it's great to see you again.
You too.
That was great. So thank you for that. I think it's actually perfect time then to ask Eric to take himself off mute. So we've asked Eric Claude from NPR Product Development kind of give us an update on where things are. I'm sure for a number of you, and I know for a number of our member companies, when COVID-19 hit, that doesn't mean that you stop having to actually put products onto the market and keep going with your processes, and trials, litigation, all of these things play into it. So I asked Eric to come and chat and see kind of how things have been going from that perspective.
Super. Thanks, Rachel. And thanks for having me on today. Yeah, so at NPR, I lead our healthcare practice, and we do product development, we do testing, we do a lot of strategic planning and consulting, and it's often the case that customers have us come in when they're experiencing some kind of a crisis, things go sideways. Although, I'll talk for a minute about what we've been seeing, specifically with regard to response to COVID-19, obviously, an awful crisis. But we've put our crisis response, mode into action, and it's been great to see how we've been able to really mobilize resources both within our team and throughout our network to help respond to the situation. So I have to, as part of that, I have to give a huge shout out to Marianne and the folks at M2D2, because we've been doing a lot working with them through their participation with BARDA in the DRIVE initiative that BARDA has. So 2 months ago when all this started, there was a flurry of activity working with groups that sort of in our orbit that recognized they had technologies they could bring to bear to help. And so we spent a lot of time working through M2D2, connecting groups into BARDA to get on the radar screen. A couple of those are going forward with some BARDA funding, developing diagnostic technologies. We have a really fascinating stem cell therapy that we've been working to get into a clinical study. Other respiratory therapies happening. And then, just being able to leverage the network that we have in the product development business, and some of our other guests today that are in this business know that, it's not just about the sort of the design and engineering. You need a whole network in the industry to support development of innovative new products, whether that's other consulting groups and regulatory or quality suppliers, manufacturers, and it's been great. We've been able to leverage that network to help. So just an example, we had a call from one of our friends at a Massachusetts area manufacturer that makes, one of their products is ventilators, and they were cranking up, of course, their manufacturing, had a need to expand capacity. We were able to connect them with a contract manufacturer to solve that problem like same day. I mean, this stuff is moving so fast, it's amazing. So that's been great to be able to do that, and then reshoring, as you can imagine, has been a huge issue. So folks that are making PPE in Asia and having challenges with that supply chain are looking to find manufacturing capacity here in the United States, and so we've been spending a lot of time helping in that capacity as well. So it's things have been just a crazy pace, but it's great that we've been able to put our crisis response mode into action to help in this regard. And I'm just super proud of our team and our partners that we've been able to contribute.
Yeah, I think if you don't mind, I have a couple questions. So from a product development perspective, what's kind of the, I want to say the stop, drop, and roll, right? When you hit a crisis like this and you're actually trying to do engineering and design work, what's kind of that first step back step that you need to take, right? When things start kind of flip-flopping.
Sure, great question. Yeah, I think there's sort of a human tendency to, when faced with a crisis, to look at the crisis through your particular frame of reference, whether that's from a professional standpoint or whatever other perspective you might have. So, engineers like to solve engineering problems, but not every crisis is an engineering problem, right? So we have a sort of preferential frame of reference, and I think the hardest thing to do is to try to put that aside and look at the crisis at hand and really try to understand what is the problem we're trying to solve, while not being influenced by your own bias. Albert Einstein, one of my heroes, he has a great quote where he says something like, if I had an hour to solve, the world's most important problem, I'd spend 55 minutes figuring out what the problem is, and then the solution would be evident, right? So I think that's how I approach it. It's, let's figure out what is the problem that we're trying to solve here, and then, you know, then the rest kind of follows from there.
And any kind of tips on how to speed up your timeline a bit? I mean, obviously things are probably in a great pause. How do you kind of keep yourself ready to get moving as quickly as possible when there is an opportunity?
Yeah, good question. I mean, I think it's about being able to be nimble and agile, and recognizing, you know, what priorities, what flexibility you have in terms of shifting priorities and adjusting, you know, resources to things. That can be kind of tricky. You know, in our business, the goal is keep the team, you know, fully busy all the time. So if we have to, you know, sort of refocus attention in one area, that, you know, we have to say, okay, what things can we pause for the moment so that we can refocus on something of greater urgency, and put, you know, adjust the team's efforts from that standpoint. We just, as an example, we had a huge project a year ago. It wasn't a COVID-related issue, but a giant development effort that was going on, that we had to shift resources to get it across the finish line in pretty much a record period of time, to the point that at sort of the peak of where that was operating, we were doing about a person year of effort every month for the period of about a year, to just go as fast as possible to get things done. Sometimes that means you're doing a whole bunch of stuff in parallel. And so the other point I'll make is, in accelerate, like if time is really of the essence, what you have to recognize is you may have to sacrifice some efficiency to get a lot of things pushed through the pipeline as fast as possible. That might mean there's some inefficiencies in execution that you have to accept. And sort of, I guess, a third point that I would make is, as well, particularly as we're really scrambling to help some of these new technologies get developed and across the finish line, specifically for the COVID-19 response, so they can get out in the marketplace. You know, one way that you accelerate development is you recognize where the risks are, where the tricky parts are in that development, and you might pursue 2 or 3 different solutions to those tricky parts, all in parallel, recognizing you're only going to need one, but, you know, you're going to work on 3 solutions at the same time, with the expectation that, you know, one of them is going to get you across the finish line. It's kind of like the folks developing vaccines are doing that now, right? Where they may be working on, you know, within one company, multiple different vaccine solutions, recognizing, you know, I only need one of them to be successful, and others, you know, might fail for reasons that I can't predict right now. So I got to do a bunch of things in parallel.
All right, we got 2 more questions for you.
Sure.
And these are coming from the chat bot. So what would you advise teams to do to keep existing product development projects on track while working remotely?
Yeah, so gosh, we've been doing that, and thankfully, even though everyone's remote, you know, we've been able to keep up the pace on stuff that we're doing. And a couple of things that I think are really important in this environment, probably the first and most important, is communication. So with both with customers and internally with our teams, right? So we'll have, you know, larger projects where you've got multiple folks collaborating and working on development activities. You know, those teams, our internal teams, they're meeting every day. They're getting, you know, they're getting on a Zoom call or whatever. You know, if only for a half hour, you get everybody on, you do a quick update. What am I working on today? Keeps everybody in sync. You know, what are my challenges? Who can help me? I've got this issue. Who can help? Right. So a daily sort of touch point internally, and then, you know, a frequent touch point with clients as well, just to stay in sync in this, you know, rapidly changing environment. You have to be able to communicate effectively, recognize, you know, when you're running up against challenges, and you know, collaborate to solve those problems. So I think communication is probably the most important thing to keep things going. And using the technology, using the collaboration tools as well, has been critically important.
Thanks, Eric. That is incredibly helpful. I really do appreciate your time. And I do want to point out, Doug asked in the chat bot, but I think I know the answer to this one. Does MPR do human factors testing for V&V? And I would say that's a yes, Doug. So
Sure.
you want to reach out to Eric or Jeff
Yeah,
Champagne. I know he's on the call too. You can send them both a private chat, but I know that that's something that they could absolutely help with. So I'm sure that would be a great discussion for you guys to have offline. So thank you, Eric. I really do appreciate the time.
Certainly, happy to be here. And
Absolutely. And just a little
next week
plug,
as
we've
well.
got a couple webinars coming up, and one of the ones next week is with Eric and his team. And I think it's going to be a really exciting webinar. So check out our website. I know what a website is. Check out our website and see what we've got coming up. So we've
Awesome.
got
Thanks.
one more.
Bye-bye.
Yeah, absolutely. We've got one more speaker today, Ari Feldman from Metadata. This is going to be a really great opportunity for a conversation around so many things involving clinical trials. And Ari, thank you so much for joining us. And I will turn this over to you.
My pleasure. Can you hear me okay, Rachel? And can I share my screen? That's the other
Absolutely.
question.
There's
Let
a
me
green share screen at the bottom.
Yeah, it wasn't enabled before, but hopefully, now I got to find the Zoom here. Hold on, multiple screens. Apologies. Zoom. Okay, here we go. Share screen. Now we're going to, it says host disabled attendee share screen sharing.
So
There we go. There we
okay,
go.
perfect.
I got it. Okay. Let me just make sure I've got the right one. 2. You should be able to see my screen now. Yes?
Yes.
Okay. So thank you, Rachel and Brian, Ginger, and Eric. A few minutes remaining here. Just by way of quick introduction. So as Rachel indicated, my name is Ari Feldman. I lead Medidata's global compliance and strategy function. Essentially, it's everything quality and regulatory as it relates to our products and our services. So I'm not really focused on the internal system so much as I am focused on the external side. I prepared a couple brief slides here and just wanted to give a very short perspective on, as the title suggests, what's going on in the world today in light of a pandemic, and where do we see going from here. So first thing I want to talk about, I'm really going to focus on 2 sides. One is the regulatory side and what we're seeing from the regulatory authorities, and the second one is really from what we're seeing from an industry perspective. So first on the regulatory side, and Rachel, if there are any questions that come in, please feel free to stop me and I can address them real time. So on the regulatory side, what we're seeing is a pragmatic approach that has come out from the regulators. Frankly, the US FDA took I would say a leading role here, came out with a guidance document. They did so without the traditional comment period. They've been rapid to adopt. We've heard from I've been to a few meetings and heard directly from a few of the leaders of the agency, and even they are acknowledge that perhaps where you had, we all know that that the agency itself is made up of various, I'll call it sub-agencies, CBER, CEDAR, et cetera. And we've seen them come together in a rather quick and welcome approach. We've seen them come out with revisions to that guidance. They've had Q&A sessions, et cetera, and they've responded and reacted to the feedback that's come from industry. Most of that feedback, I would say, and most of the approach that they've taken, it really does appear to be pragmatic, introducing opportunities for technology. Frankly, that things like Medidata have been saying for many, many, many years, but whether it's the regulatory authorities or industry has been slow to adopt. I'll come on to that in my next slide, but the second part of this, The other global agencies have kind of come in the same sort of approach. The EMA has come out with their guidance, which has been revised. There's reference on the bottom here to a blog which we've been updating, which has all the has a summary of each of these regulations, and we've been trying to keep it current. I hope today to fix all the links on there, because they appear to be they keep changing their references, and every time they put up a new guidance, the old link doesn't work, so I have to do that today. But MHRA in the UK, the same. Interestingly enough, Germany, who's always been a challenge in terms of some of the requirements, typically say around things like e-consent or frankly, things like e-consent is really a great area. Now they're talking about remote source data verification, where they're not being as flexible. So that's kind of what we've seen. I think what's most important to highlight is all of what's being done needs to be done, and with keeping patient safety as paramount number one. That's not negotiable. But at the same time, the ideas around data collection and monitoring and oversight, and again, they need to be maintained, but they've given leeway for alternatives. So great regulatory response. Our perspective on that is we are hoping and praying, and not just hoping and praying, but also talking directly to the agencies globally, in the hopes that some of these guidances stick. The FDA, I think it's probably a little an easier story. The EMA has said on a Q&A session last week, they were very clear that their guidance only stands in the pandemic times, and the guidance will cease to be effective once the pandemic is deemed to be over. They also said that despite the EMA coming out with a guidance relative to starting new trials, operating existing trials, COVID trials, non-COVID trials, they still reference the local and national authorities and ethics committees. So as much as we've seen their kind of giving and their flexibility, they're still kind of sticking with the very disaggregated approach.
Ari, I do have a question, if that's
Sure.
okay. I'm just
Yeah.
curious based on what you said. I know some countries, pardon me, have been more flexible than others. Has there been any flexibility that surprised you coming out of certain areas?
I think, yeah. So interestingly, it's not clear to me. Let me answer that question via the next slide, if I may. Okay. Here's what the industry's response is. The Metadata published a white paper on this, and we've updated it. I think we're now on release 5, and we'll continue to update it. I encourage you, if you haven't looked at it, it's not a long read, but it's quite an interesting read. It gives a perspective on the data in and of itself. And these are four of the challenges that we've highlighted. And kind of the metadata, our response to it and how we're addressing that. So, Rachel, the reason why I pointed to this slide to answer that question is because it's not clear to me what the surprise, whether it's coming from the way industry is accepting some of the proposals or the way the regulators are coming out with some of these proposals. So, for example, remote or source data verification has been a topic for many, many, many years. And typically that would happen on site. And now the FDA has been relatively relaxed in saying, look, you can do remote source data verification, versus the EMA, who said absolutely not, it's going to be restricted to these particular scenarios. BfArM yesterday or two days ago came out with a comment. That's Germany. They came out with a comment that it'll be even more restrictive. But if we just think about the broader concept of remote source data verification, the question I would ask is, well, it hasn't been adopted previously. Why not? Is it because the agencies, nobody could get a clear guidance, or is it because industry has been hesitant to adopt? So it's hard yet to say that from where I sit. But so if we look at what these challenges are, if we look at what these challenges are, we talk about the evolving situation, right? I think it's important to look at the insights to what is going on. Study starts, study stops, enrollments, site openings, site closings, and that kind of stuff. And like I said, I don't want to, we're limited on time and I don't need to go into it in depth here. I would encourage everyone to look at that white paper that, like I mentioned earlier, it's got some of this data, and I think you'll find it fascinating. And I think, again, if some of this data is harnessed and the concepts of this data are harnessed going forward, it has significant power. It's data that has always, I'll call it, existed, but hasn't really been used as much. And now that there's more of a force on it because people are trying to continue their trials and the like, it's taking hold. And the data in itself is interesting. The second piece, the second challenge is around, looking at different ways to enable data capture. So this really goes to providing ways for missed data or risking forms not being completed on a visit, and then being able to remotely fill them out. These are not new solutions. There are plenty of trials in the world that are using, ECOA and devices and the like. But if you look at the adoption, I think now we've seen a significant higher adoption. Rachel, back to your question, is that because the regulators have been more, open to it? I don't know. The FDA has always said, I've referenced this a few times. I heard from Dr. Scott Gottlieb right after he was still a commissioner, but he had just tendered his resignation. And his comment was, FDA stands ready. It's industry has to bring examples to us and bring us use cases, and let's talk about it and let's approve them. And of course, industry is sitting and saying, well, if the FDA would give us guidance, then we'd bring them. So it's this chicken and egg thing. So the third thing is maintaining quality and supply. So these are challenges that exist in these times. How do you get good quality data? And this goes back to this concept of remote monitoring. On-site monitoring is not possible, and the idea, because people just either can't get to the site, or they're in isolation, or they're in quarantine, or they're afraid to go out, or whatever it is, right? And now we're seeing that this idea of risk-based quality monitoring and overall remote monitoring is taking hold. And again, the idea that on-site 100% source data verification has really not doing that has a negligible effect on data quality. So again, this is what we're seeing from an industry response, and I think it's latching onto the guidance. And the last challenge here is how do you accelerate study startup, right? COVID-19 trials, getting them going quickly, and again, trial supply management, how do you manage that? You need to really rely on technology to get that going. And again, we've seen more of an uptick in those areas. So, again, very quick, the next slide has a couple of, these are some resources that we've got. This is the link on the left is, and again, these slides will be available, and I think Brenda has published these links in the chat box. The left one there is the white paper I referenced, and the right one is another similar white paper. That's actually not a white paper that's specific to COVID. It was something that we were working on, just the timing worked out well to have it up here. But this sort of just highlights overall the regulatory evolution around devices. So you might find it to be an interesting read, given the device audience here, and it does highlight many of the themes that I mentioned here. I would be remiss if and I'd get myself in big trouble if I didn't reference these upcoming webinars that Medidata will be doing with MassMedic. Again, you can join. You see these in front of you. I find all these topics to be quite interesting, given just the continuously developing environment we're in. So hopefully, Rachel, that
Absolutely. Yeah, that was great. And we'll be sharing all of this information in the email blast that we send out after this to all the attendees. So make sure you have all the links to the webinars that are upcoming, because we're really excited about those. And we're really going to start talking about the opportunities, right, to really be rethinking some of these topics. And I think you pointed out really well, as the situation kind of keeps evolving. You made me laugh with your link comment, because everything just keeps shifting so rapidly. And I know I would be curious, and I'd love to have more conversations about this, about how much we keep, and how, because we now do have use cases and we do have the data to kind of back some of that up, whereas we didn't before. And how much is kind of pushed aside as, nope, we never did it this way, we're not going to do this way. And I think we have the opportunity to kind of help design what happens moving forward. So that's a really exciting opportunity for me, I think. But thank you so much, Ari. That was a well done presentation, and you got it in on time. So we'll make sure, like I said, everyone gets these slides from all of our presenters. We'll make sure you have all the contact information, and just want to say thank you again for joining us for another town hall. And if you are not doing anything right now, there's a link in the chat bot to a webinar that Brian is speaking at. And at 4 o'clock today, I would love for you to join me for a webinar on design thinking and understanding how to design in times of crisis. So those links are in the top of the chat bot in case you're interested. But otherwise, have a great rest of your day, everyone.
take care. Thank you.
Thanks, Rachel.